Okay,
got it. Well, welcome everyone to our second session with Eric Gartman. Happy Hanukkah. This is it's really, I think, very meaningful to have this discussion this evening on the last night of Hanukkah, and we'll be lighting candles together, a Zoom lighting. And in just a moment, I know for many of us, it's a different kind of Hanukkah because of what's happening in the Middle East and also here with the rise of anti-Semitism. I mean, the front pages have never been so full of a focus on Israel, on the Jewish people, and it's for many of us it's been hard, and so and I'm looking forward to another time, another evening when perhaps we can come together, and talk about and share again. We did this very early on when the war broke out, and we need to come together again. So this evening we light these candles, these 8 candles. This is the darkest time of the year, at least in our hemisphere. The darkest days of the year. The darkest, or the shortest day is December 21st. I think that still works that way. But the darkest day is a very short day. But the darkest day is right now, yesterday and today, and there's no moon. And I'm not sure if I have this legend right in my head, but I remember reading about a legend of this Leviathan, this monster that came in the darkest of times, the darkest time and now of the year, to wreak havoc on the world, and we were able to repel this Leviathan, because we were able to increase the light. And precisely at this moment in the legend is when the Leviathan, struck, if I have the legend correct. And precisely now we've been enhancing, growing the light, during these last few days of Hanukkah to dispel darkness in the world. So, I think this evening would be meaningful for us to, maybe some of us have done this already, to strengthen our personal commitment and our collective commitment to bringing more light, into this world that is feeling such darkness right now. So with that being said, we'll light the candles, and then I'll offer a few words of introduction for Eric, welcoming Eric back to our gathering. Lisa, and some of you, Reb Lisa is new to the Am Kolel staff. Those of you who are coming on for the first time, she's helping us develop our Judaic Resource Center, doing some reaching out to folks in the community to help meet their needs. That's the mission of Am Kolel, is to meet unmet needs in the Jewish community and to respond to social issues with a progressive voice. That is our mission in one sentence. And she's joined our staff, coming from both the Reform movement, where she received as a cantor, and also from the Jewish Renewal movement, where she received also ordination a few years ago. And so welcome, Lisa. She'll light candles with us, say a few words, and then I'll introduce Eric.
If you have a menorah to kindle, please join me. If not, we will kindle together, adding this light to the world. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav V'tzivanu l'chaim she'emanu Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'asa nisim lavoteinu bayamim ha'azman hazeh. Amen. Hag Sameach, everyone.
So I'd like to introduce Eric. Eric lives locally and has made a mission to write history books for the general public. He's a graduate in history at the University of Arizona, and did graduate work at the University of Virginia and also the National Defense University. He has published books on history, and the most recent one, which is called Roots of Zionism, Historical Perspective, which we just got in just this past week to Am Kolel for our library. And you're welcome to take it out, anyone. And he also has worked for the Defense Department as an intelligence analyst. So we welcome you again, Eric. Thank you for sharing these sessions with us and helping us to understand better the roots of Zionism.
Well, thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here. Now, since last week, I went ahead and I bought a new microphone. So hopefully everybody can hear me fine just now. Be sure and let me know if there's a problem and you can't hear me, preferably not in the middle of, of the lecture. If everything is fine, then that's just great. So I'll go ahead and head on over to good old share screen, and we'll get started. Presuming everybody can hear me just fine.
Just a comment, and Lisa can add to this, if you'd like to send a remark, I think through chat. Is that right, Lisa?
Yeah, you can just send a remark to me or Eric, because he's a co-host, and we'll try to answer that as we go through the presentation. But we're going to have time for questions and answers at the end. So go ahead and put your questions in there, and then Eric will answer them at the end.
Okay. So last week, where we left off, we were talking about the competing visions among Zionism, particularly with how to deal with the Arab situation. The Zionist left, the labor movement, hoped that by improving the material position of the Arabs in Eretz Yisrael, that they would be able to come to peaceful terms, whereas the right wing, represented by Zev Jabotinsky, didn't see it that way. He thought of it more as a natural conflict, a conflict of interest between two sides, both who had a legitimate claim to the same land, and therefore he advocated building up what he referred to as an iron wall, building up their defenses to the point where the Arabs would simply have to accept them. That's where we left off last week. So during that same period of time, during the 1920s, the Jewish community in Palestine, what was referred to as the Yishuv, really grew rapidly, not just in terms of people, but just as significantly in terms of institutions, those vital organs that are necessary for a modern and functioning state. So these institutions included the Jewish Agency, pictured here on the left, which is more or less a governmental organization, sort of a quasi-government, led by none other than David Ben-Gurion. They also established, a labor union, universities, and a healthcare system as well. And yet the question, what they referred to as the unseen question, meaning how to deal with the Arabs, that continued to loom large in the 1920s, and it wasn't really clear how that issue was going to be resolved. Still, throughout most of this decade, the majority of the Zionists, the labor movement, the left wing, representing the overwhelming majority of the Zionists, was quite optimistic. There had been disturbances in 1920 and 1921, but for the next few years, there wasn't anything nearly that large. And then it all erupted in 1929. And what happened in 1929 was the largest scale violence since those earlier riots in 1920 and 21, but actually even surpassing them, and surpassing them significantly. As with those other two riots, it erupted right there in Jerusalem at the holy sites, the Haram al-Sharif for the Arabs and the Temple Mount for the Jews. It was also nationwide, as it was in the early 20s, but this time the violence was much more significant. And the worst attacks occurred in Hebron, where there's an old Jewish community that wasn't really part of the newer community with the settlers, and therefore the Haganah had no presence there. And 69 Jews in Hebron were killed. And in total, throughout this violence, about 100 Jews were killed, and it went on for several days before the British were finally able to restore order. And what we have here on the left is, it's a picture of one of the leaders of the uprising, gathering the people together and calling them to arms. He was saying that is a very important day for us because we attacked the Western conquest and the mandate and the Zionists on our land. The Arabs stood up, checked the oppression, and sacrificed their poor, pure, and noble souls on the sacred altar of nationalism. So this event in 1929 is a real shock to the Jewish community in Palestine, especially for those on the left, the labor Zionists, who had been advocating this coexistence where we're going to improve the lives of the Arabs, and therefore they're going to accept us and everything will be fine. Now they're starting to sense that they might not be able to do that. Nonetheless, the labor Zionists did not give up. Here we have a picture of several of the leaders from both sides, a meeting at the King David Hotel, which is where the British mandatory headquarters are located, trying to see if they can work something out. David Ben-Gurion himself also met with some of his counterparts. And at one particular meeting, he meets with one of the higher ranking Arabs in the British administration, and they have a polite and pleasant conversation. But this man tells Ben-Gurion that it would be better for the land to remain poor or desolate for another 100 years than to allow more Jews into Palestine. So what he's doing is he's explaining something to Ben-Gurion that Ben-Gurion hadn't really understood before, and neither had the other labor Zionists. Because it was understood that the more Jewish settlers come in, the more they build up things, like healthcare and roads, and with their, improved farming techniques and their irrigation, the lives of the Arabs would be better. And in fact, during this same time period, the healthcare for the Arabs improves dramatically, and their lifespan, goes way up, and their mortality rate goes down. Now, of course, it's not exclusively due to the influx of the Jews. Remember, it's also partially due to the fact that the territory is now being administered by the British and not by the Turks, and they do a better job. But nonetheless, all that seems to be irrelevant. And for Ben-Gurion, this is a major turning point. He said prior to this, he was under the impression that the Arabs would have no reason to oppose what the Zionists were trying to achieve. Now he realizes that that's not the case, but he's unable to come up with another answer. What are we going to do instead? And for the next few years, Ben-Gurion and the labor Zionists are going to be adrift in terms of what their solution is going to be. Now, let's turn to this question about why the Arabs did not accept what Ben-Gurion and the Zionists were offering, why they didn't accept all those improvements in their lives that would make things better. Well, that question was answered by these three philosophers who you see in front of you. And it's possible that some of you might recognize these three geniuses because they are none other than John Cleese in the middle, Eric Idle, and Michael Palin from Monty Python. They came out with a movie in 1979. Maybe some of you have seen it. It's called The Life of Brian. Raise your hand if you saw it. Okay, some of you have, some of you haven't. Well, what it is, that movie, obviously it's a comedy, and it's about a Jewish rebellion that takes place in the land of Israel during the Roman era. So the rebels get together, led by John Cleese, and they're about to vote to start a rebellion against the Romans. And John Cleese says to them, after all, what have the Romans ever done for us? And then somebody says, well, the aqueduct. Before the Romans came, we didn't have any way of transporting fresh water into the cities and the farms. Now we do. So John Cleese thinks about it and he says, okay, all right, well, I suppose that was a good thing. All right, other than that, what else? And then somebody else says, medicine. Before the Romans came, we didn't have any healthcare system. They've brought in significant improvements to our health. And then somebody else says literacy. Before the Romans came, we didn't really have any schools and nobody could really read and write. And then somebody else says they brought in this great wine. And somebody else says that the streets are safe to walk in at night. And then somebody else points out how good the road system is now that the Romans are there. And so finally, John Cleese says, all right. But apart from the sanitation, medicine, education, wine, public order, irrigation, roads, the freshwater system, and public health, what have the Romans ever done for us? And then they vote to go ahead and rebel against the Romans. So what is the point here? Why am I bringing up Monty Python? And that is to demonstrate the point that no society is going to accept this exchange that had been offered to the Jews in ancient times and that the Jews were offering the Arabs in modern times. And that exchange is, we're going to improve your life. We're going to make things a lot better for you in all the ways listed right there. But in exchange, we're going to control this territory politically. And apparently no group of people has ever been willing to do that. Nobody has ever accepted that. Just like the Jews in ancient times wouldn't accept it, the Arabs in modern times didn't accept it. Apparently that's just the way it is. Now, in January of 1933, a major event happens in Europe that most of you are surely aware of, and that is that Adolf Hitler takes power. And that is going to be significant for the future of Israel as well, because a lot of Jews are trying to get out of Germany, as you can imagine. This is known as the Fifth Aliyah. It happens, roughly from 1933 to 39, where about 200,000 Jews from Central as well as Eastern Europe enter the land of Israel. These are by far the best educated wave of immigrants ever to come into the country. And due, to their skills and abilities, they're able to really change the nature of the Jewish settlement in Eretz Yisrael. They're able to start factories. They create the legal system. There was already a medical system there, but all of a sudden it improves greatly, as do all the institutions and infrastructure. So in that short period of time, the population doubles and the economy triples, all in a very brief period of time. It's sort of like the state building process, which you would think is a fairly slow process, has undergone an extremely rapid expansion, and it does. And it's in no small part due to these people who are trying to get away from Nazi persecution. But the irony here is that these people, particularly the ones from Germany and Austria, didn't want to be there. The Jews of Germany and Austria are completely assimilated. They're absolutely enamored with German high culture, and they want to stay in Germany. It's only the rise of the Nazis that forces them quite unwillingly to leave the fatherland. And when they arrive in Palestine, it's sort of this rough place without any operas, and no theaters, dealing with a bunch of, fairly rough people who are talking nonstop about the importance, of agriculture and of building, a new state and of Jewish muscle. The two groups don't really get along that well. And what we have here on the left is a picture of these German Jews back in the old country. These men were World War I veterans, and they were gathering to remember the contribution to Germany in the First World War. So this changes the complexion of both the Jewish community in Palestine, but also of the Arabs and their response to the Zionist enterprise, as all of a sudden, in a matter of just a few years, the number of Jews doubles. Now, one of the main industries in Palestine at that time was citrus growing. You all had Jaffa oranges, I would assume. And to the Zionists, the whole way that the citrus industry was proceeding was exactly how they saw everything coming together just perfectly. Because what's going to happen with this industry is that these new settlers from Europe, are coming over there with these new techniques, free market principles, and understanding of scientific methodology, and they're going to combine that with the Arab laborers who aren't just unskilled. Some of them are unskilled, but some of them are, and who knew how to cut and graft the trees, pictured there on the left. So one of the citrus growers publishes a piece about how he views the entire citrus industry. And he says, never in history did a people enter a country as we entered our country. We are returning to a homeland that has waited for us as a wasteland. We are not entering a new country that is not ours. We are people of an ancient culture. And in the long years of our exile, we have added to that culture the great values of a new civilization, meaning Europe. All these riches we bring with us as a gift to our ancient land and to the people who have settled it while we were away, meaning the Arabs. Never before did a colonial project bring so much blessing as the blessing brought upon the country and its inhabitants by our project. So that was the way he viewed that in this article, in this newspaper piece written in 1935. And this is very much in line with labor Zionist thinking for the past 30 years, beginning when Yitzhak Epstein published his article about the unseen question in 1908. And this is basically what he recommended. We're going to work together and we're going to make their lives better. Everything is going to be just fine. And the irony here is that that newspaper article was written in 1935 because the very next year, Palestine explodes. The Arabs are watching what's going on, and they're seeing what appears to them to be a flood of foreigners entering the country and taking their lands. It didn't seem to them to be some sort of great work of rescue and redemption, as the Zionists claim it was, but to them, it's just an act of oppression. So Arab leaders demanded that the British mandate put an end to both Jewish immigration and land purchases, and also demanded an Arab majority government. The British denied their demands, and then the Arab leaders declared a strike. At that point, there wasn't any violence, but almost immediately afterwards, the violence began, and it was a major, full-scale uproar against both Zionist, what they thought of Zionist encroachment, as well as against the British, the colonial power. This wasn't just like the riots in 1929 or in the early 1920s. This is a full-scale revolt. And you get a sort of a sense of it, the scale of this uprising from, this picture on here on the left, where they're able to blow up that bridge and completely derail a British train. So at this point, the Arab revolt, it's pretty much become clear to the leaders of the Yishuv that their plans for cooperation were not going to come into fruition. And to give a sense of how the Arabs thought about this situation, the Egyptian prime minister explained, well, if Palestine were empty, we, the Arab states, would invite the Jews to come into Palestine and establish a Jewish state in it. But the country is not empty. Arabs have lived there for centuries. So the scale of the violence of the revolt is so great that Britain establishes a commission to investigate the cause of the unrest. It was led by a man named Sir William Robert Peel, and he goes throughout the country and he interviews people on both sides. The Arab delegation tells Sir Peel, "You say we are better off. You say my house has been enriched by strangers who have entered it. But it is my house, And I did not invite the strangers in or ask them to enrich it. And I do not care how poor or bare it is, only if I am master in it. So this is he's sort of echoing exactly what the characters in Monty Python had said. They put it comedically, but the Arab delegation is saying it quite seriously. Not interested in enriching my lives. I just want to be in control of what I consider to be my territory. So the Peel Commission releases its findings, and they refer to it as an irrepressible conflict between two national communities in the narrow bounds of one small country. They say that partition seems to offer at least a chance of ultimate peace, and we can see none in any other plan. So therefore, the Peel Plan becomes the very first partition plan. And there's going to be a lot more of them, a lot more plans to divide the Holy Land into two states, one Arab and one Jewish. It's now referred to as the two-state solution. So this is the very first time. And what we have here on the left is a picture of how the Peel Commission was going to divide that territory. It was going to be overwhelmingly Arab, about 4/5 represented there in purple. And the Jewish territory is that much smaller area represented in orange, only about 1/5 of the land. Arab leaders rejected it immediately. They considered all of Palestine, or what they refer to as Philistine, to be theirs. And Zionist leaders, Ben Gurion, Chaim Weizmann, publicly accept the plan. Jabotinsky, on the other side, the revisionist, the right wing, he rejects it. Nonetheless, it doesn't seem real likely that the leaders, the Zionist leaders who did accept the partition plan, would have been satisfied with just that tiny little piece of the territory that they were given. But in the end, it didn't matter, because the British government doesn't accept the Peel Commission's plan, because at that time, Britain is completely reversing course. World War II is about to start, and they need to placate the Arabs because they need the oil from that region. So instead, the British government releases a white paper, which is a policy paper, banning all Jewish immigration and turning the territory over to a majority Arab government. Well, when that happens, when the British completely reverse course and cave into all Arab demands, it's also time for the Yishuv to change course. Prior to the change of the British plans by the white paper, Ben Gurion had always opposed bringing Jews into the country illegally, because he didn't want to antagonize the British with their powerful navy. But now Ben Gurion decides there really isn't a choice. Interestingly enough, well before the war, he actually says the threat of another world war and an attendant Holocaust hangs over our heads. We can't prevent this catastrophe, but our fate on Judgment Day will depend on the strength that we have accumulated in this country. All right, so what is he talking about? Judgment Day, our fate on Judgment Day. Well, it's a recognition by Ben Gurion that they're not going to be able to achieve their independence peacefully, that they're going to have to go to war with the Arabs. And that's what he means by Judgment Day. And that's why he wants to bring in as many people as he can illegally, past the British Navy. And that was referred to as Aliyah Bet, which of course was a very difficult thing to do. We have here on the left, one of the ships that did not make it. This ship was called the Theodore Herzl, and it was organized by the Haganah. The British intercepted it, and they took the passengers from this ship and other ships and put them in detention camps during the war, either in Mauritius or in Cyprus. Then, of course, the Second World War does begin, and as the war begins and the Nazis take over more and more countries, more Jews are trying to get out of Europe and into the Holy Land somewhere safe, but the British never reversed their course. And throughout the war, the Jews who fled from the ghettos in Europe ended up in detention camps. Now, as for what happens in Europe itself during that time, as Ben-Gurion had feared, it is the absolute worst. And there are rumors reaching the land of Israel of mass murders and death camps, in 1942 and 1943, and nobody really knew if it was true. And of course, it was true. This is some ways in line with what the Zionist ideology had taught, that Jews couldn't be safe in somebody else's country. They had to have a country of their own. As it happens, the state of Israel is established after the Shoah, and most of the victims of the Shoah are not saved by the state of Israel, but nonetheless, for the Zionists, this just proves what they've been saying all along. We still need a state of our own so that all Jews worldwide can be safe. Even after the war, even after the Holocaust, the British continued to prevent the now Holocaust survivors from entering into Palestine. They want to placate the Arabs, who are still opposed to Jewish immigration. And therefore, some groups in Eretz Yisrael begin to take matters into their own hands. The most notable is the Irgun, led by Menachem Begin, who is Zev Jabotinsky's successor. And he strikes directly against British personnel with the stated goal of driving the British out of Eretz Yisrael and creating a Jewish state. Shortly after the war, the Holocaust survivors begin gathering in what are referred to as displaced person camps run by the victorious Allies, mostly in Germany. And Ben-Gurion himself went to visit some of these camps. And the Holocaust survivors who saw Ben-Gurion right there in their midst couldn't believe it. It was just unfathomable. These are people who had been hunted and hounded, and now the embodiment of the Zionist enterprise, David Ben-Gurion, is standing right there in front of them. And Ben-Gurion promises them that he's going to bring them home to Zion as soon as possible. In early 1947, the British decide they've had enough of Palestine. The Irgun had been launching attacks against their personnel in the country over the past year or so. They had to put down that massive Arab revolt in the 1930s. They've basically had enough. So they turned the issue over to this new international body called the United Nations. And in the summer of 1947, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine arrives in order to listen to testimony from both sides. Ben-Gurion says that the Jews need a state of our own because the homelessness and minority position make the Jews always dependent on the mercy of others. The others may be good, they may be bad, but they are never masters of their own destiny. They are entirely defenseless when the majority of people turn against them. Now, and as for the Holocaust, he says what happened to our people in this war is merely a climax to the uninterrupted persecution to which we have been subjected for centuries. Of course, the United Nations Committee also listens to the Arab case. And the Arab League explained why they objected to a Jewish state. The Zionist pretends that he has got a particular civilizing mission with which he returns to a backward degenerate race in order to put the elements of progress into an area which has no progress. The Arabs simply stand and say, no, we have a heritage of civilization and of spiritual life. We are not going to allow ourselves to be controlled by great nations or small nations. Nor did they want to be a minority. It would be impossible to devise frontiers which did not leave a large Arab minority in the Jewish state. This minority would not willingly accept its subjugation to the Zionists and would not allow itself to be transferred to the Arab states. They also didn't really accept arguments about the Holocaust, which was very much on the minds of not the Jews, but a lot of Europeans during this time as well. The Arab people are second to none in regarding the woes which have been inflicted on the Jews of Europe by Europeans. But the question of those Jews should not be confused with Zionism, for there can be no greater injustice than solving the problems of the Jews of Europe by committing another injustice on us, the Palestinian Arabs. The Europeans should solve their own problems instead of creating problems for other people. So these are the Arab objections, and he is correct. The Arab League is correct when saying that that if there was a two-state solution, that there would be a large Arab minority in the Jewish state who would not willingly be allowed itself to be transferred to the Arab state. And we're going to see how that's going to play out. The United Nations Special Committee, nonetheless, decides to partition the land, just like the Peel Commission did, and just like the two-state solution that you hear so much about these days. So on the left, we have a picture of how the UN envisioned the two states. On the right, we kind of have a little more complicated map, but it's important because it shows how the populations were distributed at that time. The areas on that map in blue are Jewish populations and Jewish owned land. The areas that are in green are Arab population centers and Arab owned land. You also see a lot of white on the map. And that white on the map is area that's just more or less empty. And it's that empty area that is actually the source of a lot of controversy, because both sides claim that empty area to be theirs. This is Philistine. That empty area, all of that belongs to us too. No, this is Eretz Yisrael. That land belongs to us. So that's a major source of controversy. Now, we do see that if you compare these two maps, the one on the left and the one on the right, that the United Nations really did do its utmost to try and create a state that, or states that followed as best they could where the people of the representative states were located. Nonetheless, if you take a look at that map on the left, that is extremely untenable. you've got these two states that are sort of intertwined and interconnected, and there's overlap between both sides. Pretty unlikely that either side is going to accept that as their final borders. And the Arabs did not. They did not accept the partition plan. And the Zionist leadership publicly accepted it. But once again, it seems pretty unlikely that they would have been satisfied with those ridiculous borders. So the UN did what it could, but this is a real tough situation, and it remains so to this day. So the vote takes place at the UN in late November, and it passes. But the violence between the two communities begins almost immediately. It starts off, fairly low level, sniping, but then it expands to a series of bombings between the two sides for the next 4 months or so. This is sort of referred to as the Civil War between the Arabs and Jews. And in the first half of the Civil War, the Arabs are doing better, especially in the area around Jerusalem. There is a large Jewish community in West Jerusalem, and the Arabs appear pretty close to be able to cut that community off by cutting the one road that leads from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Therefore, with the war going in the Arabs' favor, the Haganah, the defense force, initiates a new military plan, known as Plan D, whereas its previous plans, A, B, and C, were entirely defensive. This plan is a little bit more than that. It was written by Yigael Yadin, who's all of 29 years old at this point, and he writes in the introduction, the objective of this plan is to gain control of the areas of the Hebrew state and to defend its borders. So the first sentence talks about defense only. The second sentence says it also aims at gaining control of the areas of Jewish settlement and concentration which are located outside the borders of the Jewish state. So just the Jewish settlements outside of where the UN mandated our territory to be. It doesn't say anything about taking over all of Palestine. The reason I mention that is because if you look over there on the left, there it says Plan Dalet, Master Plan for the Conquest of Palestine, which is how the Arabs have always viewed Plan D, as a master plan for the conquest of all of Palestine, as well as a plan for the expulsion, the deliberate expulsion of as many Arabs from Palestine as possible. But let's continue with what Plan D actually says. Mounting search and control operations according to the following guidelines: encirclement of the village and conducting a search inside it. But here's the interesting part. In the event of resistance, the armed force must be destroyed and the population must be expelled outside the borders of the state. So that one sentence there is probably the most controversial part of the most controversial document ever written by the state of Israel. Well, and why is that? Well, it allows the military, in fact, it mandates the military, if a village offers resistance to a Haganah or an IDF attack, not only do the resistors have to be defeated, but the population has to be expelled outside the borders of the Jewish state. So to the planners of Plan D, this is a military plan designed to secure the borders of the Jewish state. But because some civilians are going to be expelled during the course of this plan, the Arabs view it as ethnic cleansing, which is a little bit unfair. Because if the Haganah has orders, if there is no resistance, then simply occupy the village, confiscate arms, and administer affairs. There were no orders for expulsions in those cases. And the plan says, the final sentence, the aim of this plan is not an operation of occupation outside the borders of the Hebrew state, which would seem to indicate that it is in no way a master plan for the conquest of Palestine, because it specifically says this is not a plan for occupation of the borders outside the Hebrew state, meaning the state that the UN allotted to the Arabs. So Plan D is a military plan, not a political one. There's nowhere you can find the text of Plan D. It's not hard to find. It doesn't say anything in there, about expelling large numbers of civilians or even conquering territory not allotted to the Jewish state. Similarly, you've probably heard this one, that Israel is guilty of ethnic cleansing. Well, those charges are made particularly in regards to what happens during the 1948 war. Because during the course of the war, somewhere in the range of 700,000 Arabs, Palestinians, flee their homes. So the question, is, well, why did they flee? Were they deliberately forced out and driven out by the Israelis, as part of Plan D and as part of some more plan to create a homogeneous Jewish state with no Arabs in it, which is what the Arabs have always claimed, and not only Arabs. This book here that I've got here on the left is written by a Marxist Israeli professor, Ilan Pappé. And you can see the title there. It says The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. And in the book, he claims that Israel deliberately initiated a policy of ethnic cleansing of Palestine so that the state that they have once the war is over will be Jewish without any sort of Arab minority. However, 160,000 Arabs remained in their homes in the territory that the UN allotted for the Jews. That's a significant number. So if the state of Israel had carried out some sort of ethnic cleansing, did it just happen to somehow overlook these 160,000 people who were then accorded civil rights under the new state? So that sort of puts the argument about deliberate ethnic cleansing, down. The question, though, still does remain about the origin of the refugee problem. What happened? So the way it occurred, it was a process. The first step, the first wave, occurred during the first few months of the war. Remember, during that campaign of bombing and sniping, when the Arab elites left Palestine, mostly from the cities, Jerusalem, Jaffa, Haifa, Tiberias. Those are the cream of Palestinian society, people with means. And it's certainly understandable that they left, Who wants to stay in the middle of a war zone when you have the means to go somewhere else? So a lot of them did leave, but they were criticized quite a bit by some of the other leaders who stayed behind, and basically saying, this is not the time to flee, we need you here. And they were right. Because by doing so, by having the leaders basically take off and abandon the country, it destabilized the entire society. The people who are left behind, they're not as well educated. The institutions that they have aren't functioning as well. And therefore, you have a situation when the war really intensifies in April, where Palestinian society had already been destabilized. And then in April, the war really begins in earnest. It really gets nasty. There are more and more operations undertaken by the Haganah and then the IDF. And there is one particularly notorious incident on the road to Jerusalem, where an Arab village known as the Ir Yassin was taken by Menachem Begin's Irgun. 107 villagers were killed during the battle, two-thirds of which women and children. And while the Irgun denied that there had been any deliberate massacre, most independent observers came to the conclusion that there was. And as a result, what the Arab Higher Committee did was it took that incident and used it to try and get the neighboring Arab states to join the cause. So they took to the airwaves, to the radio, as well as started spreading rumors about what had happened at the Ir Yassin, with these wild stories that not 100 people, but 250 people were butchered in the most horrific ways. Pregnant women were impaled, and there were numerous rapes. And it completely backfired, because instead of inducing the Arab states to intervene, which they were going to do anyway, it just created a wave of fear among the villagers who were left behind. So what happens during this period, say April, May, June 1948, when the Haganah or the IDF approaches an Arab village and the battle begins, the majority of the villagers flee. Well, why do they do so? For several reasons. One is it's probably a pretty good idea to get out of the way when there's going to be a war. If you're not one of the fighters, why stay? It's a good idea. So it's just normal thing to do. Another one is the fear caused by those exaggerated rumors of what really happened, of what actually happened at the Ir Yassin. And then there is just simply the accumulation of war. In a lot of these villages and cities, by the time let's say the final battle begins, the people who had been living there had already been undergoing, the usual traumas of war. There had been minor battles, there had been skirmishes, there had been shellings, and now there's a major battle. It's time to leave. Now, were there any deliberate expulsions undertaken by the IDF of Arab civilians? And that is yes, there were. There were roughly 400 Arab villages that were completely depopulated during their war. According to the most authoritative study done by the scholar Benny Morris, 53 had their residents expelled by the IDF after the battle, in line with what Yadin ordered under Plan D. The largest expulsions occurred from two of the larger Arab towns, Ramla and Lida in the center of the country. Those two towns, combined populations, maybe somewhere in around 70,000 people, maybe 1/10 of the total number of refugees, and they were expelled out of what the Haganah, High Command, referred to as military necessity. Those two roads, or those two towns, Ramla and Lida, straddled the highway from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, as well as the railroad running north-south. Lida was also home to the only international airport. It's now known as Lud, and that's where Ben Gurion Airport is. It's on what used to be Lida. So those people absolutely were expelled out of what the High Command, meaning David Ben Gurion, Yitzhak Rabin, and Yigal Allon, thought was military necessity. The question, well, was anybody expelled for non-military reasons, for political reasons, meaning we just want to create a state that is primarily Jewish and not Arab, and the way we do that is we're using this war as a pretext to kick these people out when it's actually not a military necessity? Well, obviously, that's a difficult question to answer. Because as the question is phrased, well, using the war as a pretext that actually wasn't necessary to kick these people out. It was just done to have a homogenous state ethnically. It's hard to answer, but the top scholar on this is once again Benny Morris, and he says that later in the war, maybe in October or September of 1948, the commander in the Southern District, Yigal Allon, he goes around and he expels the majority of the villages in the area where he is, while at the same time, in the north, in the Galilee, the commander there does not. So that would seem to suggest that a lot of Yigal Allon's actions in expelling the Arab populations, from the southern part of the country, were really more political than military. Not to mention the fact that wherever Allon was, he ended up somehow getting rid of the Arabs. So, for example, Yigal Allon also initiated what he referred to as a whispering campaign. And what he did there is he spread rumors among the Arab villagers, or among the mayors of the Arab villages, that the Jews are coming and they're going to rape and murder you. And that alone led to people, taking off. And of course, Allon was also in favor of the expulsions from Ramla and Lida. Nonetheless, the claim that there was a deliberate ethnic cleansing of Palestine is still not accurate, or else all 160,000 Arabs who lived in the borders of what was to become Eretz Yisrael would have been expelled, and they're still there to this day. Some they're referred to as Israeli Arabs or Palestinian Israelis. Now, last week, we did talk about this other touchy subject quite a bit as well. Another charge is that Israel is a colonial state. So because that was a question that seemed to get a lot of attention, I went ahead and I made another slide just dealing with that. So talking about those things and how Israel is not a colonial state because there is no motherland which the Jewish people came from and which they could return to. They weren't ordered to do so. They did not arrive intending to conquer another group of people, subjugate them. They saw it as a return to the land that was promised to them in the Bible and where they had lived for thousands of years. On May 14th, 1948, David Ben-Gurion read Israel's Declaration of Independence. And he gave the historical and legal, justifications for the state of Israel to be there in the land promised to them by God. The ceremony was actually pretty short because the Arab states had made it clear that as soon as the British left, on May 14th, that they were going to invade. So the same day that the British leave, Ben-Gurion reads the Declaration of Independence, and the Arab states invade. Ben-Gurion immediately leaves that meeting and goes to prepare for war against the Arab states. The war was long and hard, but Israel survives and actually expands its borders. So take a look at this map. On the left, we have the map that the UN proposed in 1947 with those really strange borders. And on the right, we have what actually happened. So you see the area in orange, the Jewish state, expanded greatly. Of course, it came at the expense of the Arab state. But that wasn't the only reason why an Arab state was not established. The West Bank, the area in green, was conquered by Jordan. And Jordan administered that territory and made it quite clear that they did not support an independent Palestinian state. And that remained Jordan's policy, not to support an independent Palestinian state for decades. They wanted leadership of that territory. As for Egypt, they administered the area that is now known as the Gaza Strip. You see, it's a very small piece of land right there in blue. There was no, historically, there was never any sort of separate political entity known as Gaza or the Gaza Strip. That was really an outgrowth of this war. Now, as for the Palestinian refugees who we mentioned, well, this is where they ended up. A lot of them ended up in Gaza, the majority, the largest single number in the West Bank, as well as substantial numbers in Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. Jordan was the only Arab country that offered them citizenship. The other Arab countries, Egypt, Lebanon, and Syria, did not and do not to this day. As for the refugees themselves, the United Nations set up an administration just to tend to them, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. A lot of those refugees live in those camps, but even the refugees who don't actually live in the camps are dependent on the Relief and Works Agency for welfare and for services, because there's the refugees were not incorporated into those societies, and in some cases, most notably in Lebanon, they weren't even given work permits. As for those refugees, the 700,000 or so who fled in 1948, now there's about 5 million of them. And to this day, they demand what they refer to as the right of return, to go back to their homes inside what is now Eretz Yisrael, Medinat Yisrael, before they will agree to any sort of peace settlement. And that, the right of return, that was one of the main reasons for the failure to reach a peace agreement right up here, up the road at Camp David in 2000. Now, as for the Gaza Strip, prior to the war, there had been about 80,000 people living there. And then all of a sudden, close to 200,000 refugees show up, all in that tiny space. Today, there's about 2 million refugees in that tiny territory, about 70% of which are refugees. And as all of you know, probably a little too well, the situation with the residents in Gaza has not gotten anywhere, including since October 7th, and we all know how it's been since then. So I'm going to turn to questions. I saw there were a few questions. So let's see what we have here. Let's take a look.
Can you see them? They're in the chat room. Why are they still referred to as refugees a few generations later?
The reason is because they were not granted citizenship in the countries that they ended up in. The Egyptians didn't allow them to become Egyptian citizens and let them move from Gaza into the rest of Egypt, where they, possibly could have gotten jobs, made a living, so on and so forth.
Does anyone else have any questions for Eric?
Yes, question.
Karen has her hand raised also, but
Okay.
All right.
David, yeah. So I had put two comments in the chat box, as you see. One, just to go back to the discussion we had last week, and I don't know, actually, let me lower my hand. If there was a woman last week who asked about, in a term that I would describe, well, anyway, let me start again with this. So Roger Cohen, just coincidentally, yesterday, I thought wrote, and I sent this to David earlier today, and I actually asked for your email, Eric, earlier today, because I wanted to get this article to you if you didn't see it. But just in a very timely manner, Roger Cohen wrote, I thought, an excellent piece, that's my opinion, about the whole colonial settler sort of debate yesterday. And, also, I think, agrees that this is, it would be hard to call, I think, Israel colonialist and how this has become politicized, although he does make the point that Israel's behavior in the West Bank and Gaza Strip in the occupied territories meets a different threshold for that definition. But the one thing I did want to say with reference to you putting up the Monty Python, whatever, clip is that, and I'm sympathetic. Let's just say I'm persuaded more by the arguments in the sort of short chapter on historiography that I sent you last week, written by Neil Kaplan.
I didn't get it.
Oh, I thought you did get it. You pulled it up because that was in the Routledge Companion on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The first chapter was on historiography. You had texted me about various, I remember one of them. You had texted me about an Israeli historiographer. I can't remember his name. Exactly, right. Anyway, I'm doing this in a meandering fashion. Let me try to be a little more linear in the point that I was going to make. I would say that, and I was actually going to read a sentence from Khalidi's book, that, part of why I think the Palestinian historians make the argument about colonialism is precisely the sort of rhetoric. Here's just one sentence from Khalidi's book. That colonialists always claim that they will leave the native population better off as a result of their rule, quote, the civilizing and progressive nature of their colonial projects serve to justify what it is they do. So I think that also relates to a question that was asked by someone else last week of you about, the Zionist sort of discourse. I'm not saying across the board Zionist discourse, but some of the Zionist discourse by Herzl, Weizmann, others that did claim that the Arabs would, benefit from Jewish settlement. I think that is why Edward Said, and Khalidi, they would ascribe that kind of a discourse, or they would describe it as being colonialist discourse. I don't want to go on too much. And I think there's merit in that. I do. I think that is a kind of paternalism. And I think that part of the argument is fair. I think all the other objections to sort of uniformly and in an aggregate way describing Israel as a colonial state, at least from its origins, are problematic for some of the reasons you mentioned. You mentioned indigeneity, but I would also add, other arguments about there not being a metropole, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't have an issue with that, but I am sympathetic to some other historians' arguments about that colonial discourse, this idea that we're going to make them better off. It's, I think it's problematic. The other thing, and I'm not an expert on this, I've just started in the last weeks doing deep reading, but the other comment I put in the chat box, I pulled up directly from Daniel Sokach, who's the CEO of the New Israel Fund, and many people have recommended his book, Can We Talk About Israel, which came out in 2022. And I just put out, a direct quote about the whole debate on expulsions and ethnic cleansing. I mean, I think, he said historians are divided over whether there was a master plan for the forced transfer of the Arab population. And I think this next part, or whether local military commanders were given the authority to make decisions and to take advantage of opportunities as they arose. I mean, the one person I have read a little bit of is Benny Morris on this. And I know that, there was a whole school of, of revisionist, Israeli history and historiography in, I guess, the 70s or the 80s. And Benny Morris, by sort of doing the archival research he did and documenting, and you've read more of him than I have for sure, documenting some of the atrocities committed by Israeli Defense Forces. He wasn't able, as he himself said, to get a job for 6 years going up against those sacred cows. No, I mean, but there's a whole school. It isn't just Benny Morris and Elon
I can tell you a lot about the school of that you're referring to. So what Karen is talking about was beginning about 1986 or so. A lot of the archives from the war period from 1948 or so were opened, and a bunch of scholars went in and examined the archives, and they came out with several books, and these books, they challenged the traditional Zionist historiography of what had happened during that war and the time before it. And they were given a name. They're either called revisionists or new historians, but they weren't a coherent school of thought. They were just a bunch of historians who had found, who were given access to new documents, and who therefore interpreted it in a different light. They don't all agree with each other by any means. So they don't represent one way of thinking. The majority of those authors ended up, more or less, on the far left, but certainly not all of them, and most notably, Benny Morris, who to this day, remains the most widely read and best respected of them. Now, I did want to address a question that David wrote. Let me read it to everybody. It says, can you talk about the Ichud, the binational Zionist party founded by Judah Magnus, Martin Buber, Henrietta Zold, and others? And before I do that, I want you to tell us what you know about this party. David, I'm referring to.
Oh, yeah, okay. Um, this party, as I've learned, grew out of an organization called Brit Shalom, going back to, I believe, the 1920s into the 30s. And does everyone, not everyone probably knows who Martin Buber was, or Judah Magnus, or Henrietta Zold is a little more familiar because as the founder of Hadassah Hospital, named after her. Judah Magnus, Reform rabbi spent many years on the West Coast, and then made Aliyah and became president of the Hebrew University. Martin Buber, extraordinary Jewish philosopher, who is from a kind of an interesting kind of background from Vienna. He was raised by his grandparents, essentially, very, very knowledgeable Jews, Haskalah scholars. His mother, a French philosopher, I believe, so I recall. And Martin Buber, became very close with Theodor Herzl, beginning of the Zionist movement, broke with Herzl, and aligned himself with Achad Ha'am, who founded the stream. I think you mentioned him last week, Eric, stream of Zionism called cultural Zionism. Martin Buber Zionism was a more spiritual Zionism, and these Martin Buber and also Achad Ha'am of Eastern Europe background recognized the seriousness of coming into a land of, and their roots, their form of Zionism, the roots of Zionism for them and for many of the East European Jews in particular, the roots of Zionism go back to the Tanakh, go back to the prophets, go back to, we were talking about Shivat Zion, we were talking about the prayers, the liturgy, of Shivat Zion, the return to Zion, that is at the heart or the roots of the modern Zionist, movement, if you wish. And then Martin Buber left Germany, was forced to leave Germany. He was invited to teach at the Hebrew University, forced to leave because of Nazism. He had started along with others, he was very involved in the Lehrhaus, the adult Jewish education program there, which is very, very popular. He was succeeded by Abraham Joshua Heschel. They were very close. Anyway, Buber resonated with me amongst all the Zionists because he recognized that there was a people in there, also people there in Palestine, that also wanted to have a national identity, had a national identity, and wanted and yearned for their own state or their own country. And he recognized that along with Achad Ha'am and others. And there was a tremendous struggle. He founded Ichud. Ichud means unity. And this is a movement toward the creation of a binational state, where, it's complicated to get into all the details of it, but where institutions and would be shared by Palestinians and by Jews. And they were actually, on the Arab side of it, there was actually a committee of Arabs that also shared the same vision. They unfortunately, as I read, this is many years ago when I was into reading more about this particular history, and many of their leaders were assassinated. So Martin Buber and Judah Magnus and others, they proposed in the discussions about what to do to the British and also to the United Nations, the partition, discussing the partition plan. They proposed this idea of creating a binational state. And I don't remember the details of it. Maybe you do, Eric, but it lost, by just a couple of votes, as I recall, in an initial discussion of what to do. But when the vote was finally put before the United Nations, was overwhelmingly in favor of a partition plan. So that's my, there's much more to it, but I recommend that, everyone read Martin Buber's work. a land of two peoples, and that is, my personal, Zionism is based, and rooted in Martin Buber's Zionism, and Echad Ha'am's Zionism, and I think that ultimately, that the two-state solution is a step towards a confederation, towards a binational state or a confederation. And this idea is not new. In fact, a couple of years ago, maybe, or 2 or 3 years ago, it was again brought up and discussed in certain circles in Israel. But of course, it creates all kinds of dilemmas for various populations in Israel. And anyway, I'll leave it there. But please expand on that, Eric, if you can.
Okay, well, let's start with you mentioned the binational plan proposed by the UN. So what happened, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, remember I mentioned that they recommended a partition plan. That was also known as the majority plan because 8 of the 11 members of UNSCOP proposed that plan. There was also the minority plan proposed by 3 members, which called for exactly what you were talking about, a binational state in which there would only be one state, one government in all of Palestine, both Arab and Jewish. Since they were outvoted 8-3, in UNSCOP, that plan didn't go forward to the UN General Assembly. However, the way the binational plan was viewed at the time was simply as a pretext for Arab domination of a state in Palestine, because the Arabs still at that point represented 2/3 of the population of Palestine. Therefore, a one-state solution at that time would have simply been an Arab-dominated state. And that was the context with which most of the Zionist leadership viewed the binational state. Ultimately it didn't matter because it was never put forth as an option. The UN voted on what they refer to as the majority plan, which is partition. Now, Rabbi Schneier also mentioned just more generally the idea, of a one-state solution, a binational state. And yes, that has been proposed many times over the years. The party that Rabbi Schneier mentioned was just one of those groups that put forward that plan. Another group that had put forward a binational state over the years have been Marxists, communists. Because remember, according to communist Marxist ideology, the most important issue is not ethnicity or nationhood, it's class. So there would be one state representing the workers, both Arab and Jew, of Palestine. And that was their idea. More recently, there have been other attempts to revive the binationalist solution. It generally has not received as much attention as a two-state solution, and over the years, the majority of the proposals, for a solution to the problem over there have generally involved, partition, including the one time that there actually was a long-lived peace process between the two sides. The Oslo peace process, which lasted a good 7 years, from 93 to 2000, it was more or less, a partition, of the Holy Land. But the one-state solution, the binationalist, has always sort of been second fiddle, to the idea of partition, And it remains so to this day.
You just like to, I don't know if you remember the name, folks, from Oslo. Of course, you mentioned Oslo, but it was Yossi Beilin, you know, who was one of the principal proponents of, you know, of the binational state or the confederation. And more recently, I think just a few years ago, it came again, and he was, and there are Palestinian leaders who also have joined with him, you know, in promoting this idea. Now, obviously, it hasn't gotten very far, you know, and you know, just looking at the situation today and looking into the future, I think many of us, you know, Jewish leaders and Palestinian leaders need to go back to, you know, that thinking and go back to the philosophy of call it a philosophy, or call it a socio-political solution, but it's also very much a, you know, it's rooted in the sanctity, the recognition of the rights and the sanctity of both peoples, you know, more than any other approach to the conflict. You know. Good morning.
Okay, well, thank you. Very good. Do we have any more questions before we wrap this
I
up?
was trying to put the link to your book in the chat, but I don't think it worked. It was from Amazon.
Yeah, it worked.
Amazon link. Is that it?
Yeah, I got it.
Okay, good. I highly recommend everyone read the book because it has a lot more detail in it. Also, I really learned a lot about the post-war era, and I just learned so much just tonight about Plan D. And I mean, I'd read about it in the book, but it really is, you know, very, very eye-opening, and it tells us a lot about why we're in the place that we are today. Although I think in many ways, this could have been avoided along the way, and it just didn't happen. But the roots of the conflict are so deeply personal to all of us. I mean, they're personal to Jews, they're personal to Arabs, they're personal to those who've lived on the land for so many centuries, and we, you know, we feel that pain very, very. I mean, I feel the pain very, very strongly, and I know that we all are praying for a peaceful settlement to this conflict. And many times when I was reading passages in the book, I thought, oh, well, we're just in the same place with bigger guns, bigger arms, and bigger armies. And it's mind-boggling how our earth is destroying itself, how our people are destroying themselves. So as
just one more thing, I'd like to just invite those of you who have been with us this evening, last week, to make suggestions, you know, for future subjects related or topics related to this conversation, related to the crisis, and we'll see if we can, you know, create and offer more opportunities for us to get there and to learn. I can't believe that there are so few synagogues and temples, you know, Jewish institute that are offering programs like this. I've been asking, you know, folks around town, and there's very little. I think I might have mentioned to Lisa and perhaps to Eric that I was blown away at the Landau House, which is a senior citizen assisted living facility. There was a course, several weeks, on the history of Palestine, it was called, for seniors there. On the history, it took place just after the war broke out, and it started before the war broke out, in fact. And I said, wow, you know, who's doing that? And it's more education, you know, needs to be done. So please, we invite your suggestions. We'd like to
Yeah.
help.
And we want to thank Eric for being with us, and please reach out to us with any suggestions you might have for programming in the future. Rafe, did you have something you wanted to say before we end? You have to unmute. Can you unmute?
He's trying. Get that button.
There you go. You got it.
Yeah, on the future programming, I was just struck by two things right at the moment. One is that perhaps there's a program on options. I mean, David was just describing, these sort of big picture visions of a potential future. Okay, but how do people envision going forward at some point here? I don't think anybody, but that's a discussion. What are the options? And the other thing I think in terms of process is that I'm sure you've had many hours of this, but being able to talk about it ourselves and have a discussion, however that might work, feels important. In other words, to find our own voices a bit more, as we have taken in so much great history and analysis here. Anyway, it's my.
Thank you. Very well said. Thank you.
We'll do it. Okay, thank you. Thank you again. Thank you. Oh, we have another question. Bob?
Yes.
Bob?
I would think it would also be very helpful to have the Arab voice. We've been hearing it from the Jewish perspective, and it would be good to bring in an Arab voice, so we could hear both, to hear what the person has to say as well.
All right. Thank you. We should definitely do that. Those of you on on this evening who have come to our high holiday services know that almost every year we have someone with the Palestinian voice come and speak to us. And another recommendation for an organization in Israel that is out there with these discussions, the Shalom Hartman Institute. They're doing incredible work trying to share an open discussion, on these important issues of Jewish identity, and I recommend so highly what they're doing, so highly.
Thank you, David. Very important. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate you all, and look forward to seeing you in our next program.
Thanks.
Chag Sameach, everybody.
Chag Sameach.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Nice.
Thanks
Bye.
again, Eric. Good luck with everything. Hope to see you again soon.
Yes.
And David, Shabbat Shalom. I'll see you next week.
Shabbat Shalom.
Okay. Bye-bye.